Hey you guys, how are you? Hope everybody's doing pretty well and staying healthy. It's been a little bit of time since I put on one of these lessons for you, so I want to put on another one for you. Now that we're starting a new chapter, which is the medieval time period, I figured it'd be a great time to start doing these lessons again. So, um, the next lesson that I want to put on for you guys is the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages, um, there's a lot. There's a lot about the Dark Ages. It's a pretty big topic. And so there are a lot of different areas that we're going to cover in the Dark Ages. So I found it best to kind of create, a chart that explains some of these different areas that explain what the Dark Ages are, like an overview. And then we'll go into these topics as time goes on individually. All right. And so there are many more than the ones that I'm listing on here. These are the ones that I think are important that I want you to know, but I'm sure there are plenty others that can be listed as well. And so, with that said, let's get started here, and I'll try to do my best to explain the Dark Ages to you guys. All right. So the Dark Ages is the time period that occur right after the fall of the Western Roman Empire for Europe. Okay, remember that the Byzantine Empire will continue to exist for about 1,000 years after Rome's collapse. So the Eastern Roman Empire will wind up not only surviving but thriving during this time period. But in the Western Roman Empire and most of Europe, times are hard. Times are going to be pretty difficult. Rome was the stabilizing force of the world. It was the big system of law, the big system of governance. It was what kept things organized. It's what kept things going. It was civilization itself. And so when Western Rome falls, a lot of historians say that civilization falls with it, especially for Europe. Okay, in other parts of the world, things are going great during this time period, which is why to call it the Dark Ages is kind of misleading. The term Dark Ages was given by people who favored the Roman style era of education and learning, and it was given during the period of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is the rebirth. It's the rebirth of the classical age. And so in comparison to the Renaissance and the classical world, this is a period in history where you don't have those elements of knowledge. You don't have those elements of literacy and pursuing scientific thought and reasoning, which is why people in the Renaissance started to call this era in history the Dark Ages, and the name kind of has stuck ever since. But make no mistake, while this is going on in Europe, other parts of the world are thriving, particularly the Middle East, where Islam starts to rise, all right, and you have Islamic empires come into power, and they implore education and the arts. In fact, the school for thought and learning and education transfers from Rome to the Middle East, to places like modern-day Baghdad, where education was revered and where they continued to pursue scientific thought and knowledge and discovery, especially mathematical discovery. It's during this time period in the Dark Ages that Muslims create the modern day numerical system. Roman numerals are a thing of the past, obviously. We use them for ceremonial purposes. But a new system develops, and it's the numeric system that we have today. The placeholder of 0, the digits 1 through 9, right? And beyond that, the other numbers. And today we call it the Arabic number system. So that's just one example of Muslims during this time period making extreme contributions to math and science and things like this. We can go into that later. Today I want to focus on Europe and the Dark Ages, what happened in Europe. Remember that this time period is not dark. It is not like it's very dark outside and it just continues to be dark out. That's not what the Dark Ages is implying. Again, the Dark Ages implying that this is an era of limited scientific growth and limited education. People And one of the topics that I guess I'll start with, people don't really need it at this time. It is a chaotic time period after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, where you have a lot of tribal groups, especially Germanic groups, that are claiming land and starting their own kingdoms and trying to organize themselves in Europe out of the ashes of the Roman Empire. And so people are fleeing. There's a need for safety. You know, Rome provided that safety, and now that Rome was gone, who was going to provide safety? Who was going to provide the ability for these people to not be slaughtered or killed by random criminals or malicious enemies, large armies from people that might not be from the area? And so there wasn't as much of a need for education during this time period, because all you were trying to do is survive. You were trying to exist and not be slaughtered. So people weren't like, all right, let's go ahead and sit down and learn about the ways of the Romans and the Latins, and let's start delving into this, into the knowledge more. They needed to have food, and they needed to have safety, the priorities. And so education kind of fell on the back burner for a long period of time. Again, one of the reasons why it becomes known as the Dark Ages. All right, so, and as we're on that topic, we'll continue, I suppose, a little bit more. One of the other things that you'll notice in the Dark Ages is this a regressive time period of knowledge, especially when it comes to Roman inventions and discoveries. And it's clearly evident because of the buildings that they make. I mean, the buildings are very shoddy. They're put together hastily out of basic materials, mostly out of wood and mud and moss. And the Roman people built their structures from bricks as well as from concrete, which is in itself an invention that is lost for a lot of parts of Europe. They don't use concrete anymore. That knowledge is lost, the ability to how to work with it and to make it. And so we don't see a lot of structures being built on a grandiose scale. They are very simple based, just to the point. And that speaks volumes about the Dark Ages. It was not an era of luxury. It was not an era of trying to make something massive and spectacular. It was an era of survival, especially in the early parts of this time period, right after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. All right, and so this gets put on the back burner, and other things start to emerge. Okay, and so one thing that I already mentioned is that there are regional conflicts, right? Germanic groups of people mostly that are looking to control different parts of territory, and are carving out what will eventually become today's countries in Europe. Some of those countries still exist. For example, the Franks, right? We see the territory of the Franks, and I mean, the Franks settle in what is modern-day France. They're not just French, however. They are Germanic in scope, but, the Franks form modern-day France, and there's others as well. One thing you should know is that because this is a chaotic time period and Rome was that stabilizing force, when it goes away, so does the government, right? The government of Rome goes away. And so what type of government rises out of the ashes of the Romans? It's a system of governance called feudalism. Feudalism is essentially, it's an exchangement of services for land and for prestige and for power. All right, it's when you trade your services that you're skilled in, especially if you're like a warrior, for example. If you have a horse and you are a trained combatant, you would exchange your service on the battlefield for a plot of land, right, that you could manage, and you could have peasants farm for you, and then you could sell that produce and make money. It was all about exchanging services, and you would get land in exchange for that. Okay, we call these fiefs and fiefdoms, right? The fief is the leader, the fiefdom is the plot of land, right? And so that would be an example of an exchangement of a service for land, and that would be the knight. But this goes all the way up to the top, and we're going to do more on feudalism. This is just a brief overview, but you have the king at the top, And then you have your lesser lords, and they go down, right? And so the king would say to his lesser subjects, he would say, make sure this province or region within my kingdom is under control, make sure it's safe and productive, and you can be in control of that. Build a castle, manage the local affairs, and report to me and answer my call if need be. And it continued to go down from there. Right? All the way at the bottom, you had your peasants and your serfs. Right? And there's a difference between a peasant and a serf, which we'll get into as well later. Religion is probably one of the most important parts during this time period. Christianity rises in Rome. Some people will say that it's one of the things that led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, not the only thing. But it is extremely important. To know anything about the Dark Ages and the medieval time period, you need to know about religion, especially about the Catholic Church, which will wind up being so influential that it really challenges the power of the kings themselves of their own countries. And there will be a really important concordat or an agreement that needs to be approached. And we'll talk about that, putting out terms here right now that might be a little confusing, but we'll do something on the Concordat of Worms, which is a city in Germany, and essentially is going to limit the power of the church as well as the king, and settle once and for all who has the last say in things. Because for a period of time, the Catholic Church becomes so powerful that they're beginning to question the kings themselves within their own countries. And so you have, really, there is no separation of church and state at this time. The church really is the state. They control all affairs.